Greta Dudko. The first case on our list is Greta Dudko. Born in Lithuania, Greta had immigrated to Ireland, where she became a highly regarded nurse. Her career showed promise and dedication to helping others. However, her professional life began to unravel when issues with substances developed. She was eventually suspended from her nursing position after appearing at work under the influence. This suspension marked the beginning of a downward spiral. Greta had married Vitaly Dudko, and they had a son together. However, the marriage experienced strains. To help with childcare during these difficult times, Greta's mother, Anna Butautien, moved from Lithuania to Ireland. Anna took on the responsibility of caring for her grandson while Greta dealt with her struggles. The family dynamics were tense. Greta's situation with substances worsened. She was mixing various medications with drinks, including prescriptions meant to help with sleep and nerves. On Christmas Eve in 2010, an argument erupted between Greta and her mother. During the confrontation, Anna made statements that Greta found deeply offensive. Anna insulted Greta's parenting abilities. She also threatened to take Greta's son back to Lithuania. For Greta, already struggling with her circumstances and under the influence of various substances, these words triggered a reaction. The argument escalated beyond words. Greta struck her mother's head against a wall. She also used a glass bottle to harm Anna, causing fatal blunt force trauma. Could substances truly impair someone's judgment to this extent? After the confrontation, Greta called emergency services. When they arrived, she attempted to claim what happened had been an accident. However, the forensic evidence told a different story. The injuries Anna sustained were consistent with intentional acts rather than an accidental fall or mishap. Investigators examined the scene carefully. The pattern of injuries suggested deliberate force. The medical evidence showed multiple impacts that could not be explained away as accidental. During interviews with police, Greta eventually admitted to the actions she had taken. However, she attempted to justify them by citing provocation. She emphasized what her mother had said about her parenting and the threat to take her son. Her defense team would later argue that the combination of substances and medications had severely impaired her judgment. They presented expert testimony about how certain substances can have paradoxical effects when mixed with certain medications, potentially increasing impulsivity and reducing inhibitions. Greta faced trial for taking her mother's life. The first trial ended without a verdict when the jury could not reach agreement. This hung jury meant she would need to be tried again. The second trial lasted 11 days. The prosecution presented the forensic evidence showing the deliberate nature of the injuries. They presented testimony about the argument and what had been said. The defense continued to argue that Greta's mental state had been severely compromised by the substances in her system. In 2014, after the 11-day trial, the jury found Greta guilty of taking her mother's life. The verdict came after careful consideration of all the evidence. The jury concluded that regardless of what substances were in her system, Greta had intentionally harmed her mother in a way that led to Anna's passing. The mandatory sentence for such a conviction in Ireland is life imprisonment. Greta was sentenced accordingly. Greta appealed the conviction, arguing various legal points. However, in 2018, the appeal was denied. The court found no legal errors that would warrant overturning the conviction. As of 2026, Greta Dudko remains incarcerated at the Dochas Centre, Mountjoy campus in Dublin, which is the primary high-security facility for female offenders in Moyle, Ireland. The next case would involve someone with a prior conviction returning to harm. Nicole Flagg. In 2015, in Pleasant Ridge, Ohio, 43-year-old Nicole Flagg faced charges for the passing of her 61-year-old mother, Mervinia Lowe. This was not Nicole's first serious legal trouble. In 2003, she had been convicted of involuntary manslaughter and robbery in connection with the passing of Jeffrey Brown. She had served 8 years for that conviction before being released. Mervinia Lowe worked at Cincinnati Children's Hospital and was described by her family as the best person they knew. She had 2 children, including Nicolai and a son named Maurice Allen. On April 10, 2015, something happened at Mervinia's residence that would end her life. Nicole had come to her mother's home. What followed was a confrontation that resulted in Mervinia being stabbed multiple times. The motive appeared to be financial. Nicole took items from the residence, including cash, cards, a phone, and her mother's Lexus, which she used to flee the scene and remain at large for nearly 2 weeks. After the incident, Nicole attempted to clean the scene. She used cleaning materials in an effort to remove evidence. However, forensic analysis would later reveal what had occurred. The body was not discovered immediately. It was Maurice Allen who requested a welfare check on his mother after receiving an unusual voicemail message that concerned him. When police arrived at Mervinia's residence, they found her deceased. The injuries indicated she had been stabbed multiple times. The scene also showed signs of cleaning attempts. How does someone return to such actions after serving time for similar offenses? Nicole did not immediately turn herself in. She remained at large for 12 days after the incident. During this time, police worked to build their case. They examined the evidence at the scene. They interviewed witnesses. They tracked Nicole's movements. On April 22nd, Nicole turned herself in to authorities. She was arrested and charged with taking her mother's life, along with additional charges related to the theft and the tampering with the scene. The case went to trial in Hamilton County Common Pleas Court. The prosecution presented the forensic evidence showing the multiple stab wounds and the attempts at cleaning. They presented testimony from Maurice Allen about his mother's character and the circumstances that led to the welfare check. They showed that Nicole had taken items from the residence, establishing a robbery motive. The evidence of her prior conviction for similar offenses demonstrated a pattern of behavior. In December 2016, the jury found Nicole guilty. The convictions included taking a life with aggravating circumstances, improper treatment of a body, robbery, and tampering with evidence. The verdict came after the jury considered all the evidence presented during the trial. The multiple convictions reflected the various aspects of what Nicole had done. On January 9, 2017, Judge Stephen Martin imposed the sentence. Nicole was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole, plus an additional 15 years. During the sentencing hearing, Nicole made a statement. She continued to deny responsibility, telling the court that she did not take her mother's life. However, the evidence and the jury's verdict told a different story. Maurice Allen also spoke during the proceedings. He described his devastation at losing his mother. He emphasized that Mervinia had been the best person and that Nicole had taken her away from the family. Nicole Flagg is currently incarcerated at Dayton Correctional Institution in Ohio. The life sentence without parole means she will never be released. The case demonstrated how prior convictions for similar offenses can establish patterns that courts considered during sentencing. For Mervinia Lowe's family, particularly Maurice Allen, the conviction brought some justice, but could never replace the person they lost. Another case would involve a family secret revealed too late. Simona Zafirovska. In Brisbane, Australia, 22-year-old Simona Zafirovska was raised by a woman she believed was her biological mother, Radhika Zafirovska. Both had immigrated from Macedonia to Australia. Radhika was described by those who knew her as a loving and generous person. However, the relationship between mother and daughter had become strained. In the weeks before October 2016, Radhika had confided in a journalist that the situation at home had become unpleasant. On October 28, 2016, Radhika was sleeping in the family home in The Gap, a suburb of Brisbane. During the night, Simona entered her mother's room. She had obtained pieces of artificial wood. While Radhika slept, Simona struck her repeatedly with these pieces. The attack caused severe facial injuries and skull fractures. Radhika died from the blunt force trauma she sustained. The method was brutal and sustained. suggesting intense anger or determination. After the attack, Simona called emergency services. When she made the call, she claimed that an intruder had broken into the house and harmed her mother. She attempted to create a narrative that would divert suspicion from herself. When police arrived at the scene, they began investigating the supposed break-in. However, aspects of the scene did not align with Simona's account. There were inconsistencies that raised red flags for investigators. What would drive someone to harm the person who raised them? Forensic examination of the scene revealed crucial evidence. The pieces of artificial wood that had been used as weapons were found in Simona's room. If an intruder had committed the act, these items would not have been in her possession. Additionally, investigators examined drainage systems and other areas where an intruder might have left traces of blood or other evidence. They found nothing to support the intruder theory. The evidence increasingly pointed to someone already in the house. Simona was arrested and interviewed by police. During these interviews, she maintained her story about an intruder. She provided details about the supposed break-in. However, investigators found these details inconsistent with the physical evidence. They continued to question her account. Eventually, Simona was charged with taking her mother's life. The case went to trial at Brisbane Supreme Court. The trial lasted 3 weeks, during which the prosecution presented the forensic evidence disproving the intruder's story. In 2019, the jury found Simona guilty of taking her mother's life. During sentencing, Justice Lyons described the intruder's story as elaborate. The judge emphasized that Radhika had been a loving mother who had done nothing to deserve what happened to her. Simona was sentenced to life in prison with a minimum term of 20 years before she could be considered for parole. After the trial, a remarkable fact emerged. DNA testing conducted as part of the investigation revealed that Simona had been adopted. She was not biologically related to Radhika. This information had apparently been unknown to Simona during her upbringing. Some speculated whether discovering Macedonian origins or feeling deceived about her identity might have contributed to the tensions in the household. However, the exact motive for the attack remained unclear even after the conviction. In 2022, there was a proceeding regarding Radhika's estate. The court ruled that Simona would be denied any inheritance from her mother. This decision reflected the principle that individuals should not benefit financially from taking someone's life. Simona lodged an appeal against her conviction, but as of 2026, she remains incarcerated in a Queensland prison. The next case would center on beliefs that clouded judgment. Patricia Labossiere. Patricia Labossiere had struggled with mental health issues for much of her adult life. She had been diagnosed with conditions including a disconnection from reality and extreme mood fluctuations. She had been institutionalized multiple times for treatment. One of her persistent beliefs was that her mother, Julia Bradshaw, practiced harmful rituals. Patricia claimed she heard voices and that her deceased brother had warned her about these supposed activities. These beliefs were symptoms of her mental health conditions rather than reflections of reality. On October 27, 2000, Patricia was living with her 67-year-old mother in Attleboro, Massachusetts. That night, while Julia slept, Patricia entered her room. Patricia stabbed her mother multiple times with a knife. After the attack, Patricia called police. When they answered, she told them she had harmed her mother. She explained that she was tired of what she perceived as her mother's behavior. The statement was direct and showed no immediate remorse for what she had done. Police arrived at the residence and found Julia Bradshaw deceased from multiple stab wounds. Patricia was arrested at the scene. The evidence was straightforward. Patricia had called and admitted to the act. The physical evidence matched her account. The question for the legal system became not whether Patricia had done this, but how her mental state should factor into the proceedings. Patricia's history of mental health treatment was well documented. Her beliefs about her mother, while false, had been genuinely held due to her conditions. How does the justice system handle cases where delusions drive actions? Rather than proceed to a full trial, Patricia accepted a plea agreement. On September 9, 2002, she pleaded guilty to second-degree taking of life and related charges. The plea acknowledged what she had done, while allowing consideration of her mental state in sentencing. Justice Paul Carney sentenced Patricia to life in prison with the possibility of parole, plus an additional 5 years to be served at the same time. This sentence meant Patricia would eventually have the opportunity to seek parole if she could demonstrate she no longer posed a risk. For many years, Patricia remained in prison. She received treatment for her mental health conditions. In 2020, she appeared before the parole board for the first time. During this hearing, she spoke about her actions. She described the decision as drastic and acknowledged there was no joy in what had happened. However, she also continued to refer to her mother as a lifelong enemy. This language suggested that despite treatment, some of her beliefs persisted. In 2025, Patricia appeared before the parole board again. By this time, she was 63 years old and had served 23 years. A mental health professional testified on her behalf, stating that Patricia posed a low risk of repeating such actions. The professional explained that Patricia's age and time in treatment had reduced the likelihood of future incidents. However, the board had concerns. Patricia still held some of the beliefs that had driven her to harm her mother. The beliefs about harmful practices had not fully disappeared despite years of treatment. The parole board vote was close. Some members felt Patricia had made sufficient progress and that continued incarceration served no purpose. Others felt that the persistence of her beliefs meant she could not be safely released. Ultimately, the board denied parole in a narrow decision. Under Massachusetts guidelines, her next review has been scheduled for 2 years later. In 2027, Julia Bradshaw's family had opposed Patricia's release, feeling that she remained a danger. As of 2026, Patricia Labossiere remains incarcerated in Massachusetts. Her case illustrates the challenges the justice system faces when mental health conditions intersect with serious offenses. Another case would emerge from circumstances of housing instability. Rebecca Olenchak. Rebecca Olenchak and her mother, Kimberly Venos, had been living without stable housing since 2008. After losing their home to foreclosure, they had been staying in a small hut in Bucks County, Pennsylvania. The conditions were difficult. The hut provided shelter but little comfort. Rebecca worked as a waitress, trying to save money. Her goal was to gather enough funds to secure an apartment where she and her mother could live with dignity. She saw this as their escape from the situation they were in. However, tensions arose between Rebecca and her mother over finances. Rebecca had been carefully saving money from her waitressing job. She had accumulated what she hoped would be enough for a security deposit and first month's rent. Then she discovered that Kimberly had spent the money. The savings Rebecca had worked so hard to build were gone. When Rebecca confronted her mother about this, Kimberly refused to leave the hut. She would not consider moving to better housing, even if Rebecca could save again. On October 17, 2010, while Kimberly slept in the hut, Rebecca took action. She had obtained a bat. She struck her mother's head 10 to 15 times while Kimberly was unable to defend herself. The attack caused severe skull fractures. After the attack, Rebecca poured kerosene around the hut. She ignited the flammable liquid, setting the structure on fire. She then secured the door with a padlock from the outside, preventing any escape from the burning hut. Could desperation over living conditions truly lead to such actions? However, Kimberly survived the initial attack despite her severe injuries. She managed to escape the burning hut. When help arrived, Kimberly was able to speak. She told responders that her daughter had tried to take her life. These were her final words before she passed away from the combination of her injuries and the effects of the fire. The statement from the victim herself provided crucial evidence about what had occurred and who was responsible. Rebecca fled after setting the fire. Authorities launched a search for her. She was eventually located in Tennessee. When she was arrested and interviewed, Rebecca confessed to what she had done. She explained her frustration over the spent savings and her mother's refusal to leave the hut. The confession provided details that matched the physical evidence from the scene. Forensic analysis confirmed the skull fractures from the bat and the burns from the fire. Rebecca faced trial in Bucks County in June 2011. The trial proceeded without a jury, with the judge hearing the evidence directly. Mental health evaluations had been conducted. Based on these evaluations, Rebecca was found guilty but mentally ill of first-degree taking of life and setting a fire. The mentally ill designation meant that while she was responsible for her actions, mental health factors had played a role in what occurred. On October 13, 2011, Judge Ceparulo imposed sentence. Rebecca received life in prison without the possibility of parole for the charge related to her mother's passing. She received an additional 12.5 to 25 years for the arson charge to be served at the same time. The life sentence meant Rebecca would never be released. The prosecutor emphasized that the evidence against Rebecca had been overwhelming. The defense had attempted to focus on the stresses Rebecca had been under and her mental state. Rebecca Olenchak is currently serving her life sentence at SCI Cambridge Springs after being transferred from the diagnostic unit at SCI Muncie. The next case would involve an elderly victim and concealment efforts. Julia DeLuny. In January 2024, in the Kandala area of Wellington, New Zealand, 53-year-old Julia DeLuny was living with her 79-year-old mother, Helen Gregory. Helen was elderly and vulnerable, dependent on her daughter for care and assistance. The relationship between mother and daughter had become strained. Evidence would later suggest there had been a breach of trust, possibly involving financial matters. The exact nature of the conflict was clarified during the trial as a dispute over Julia's unauthorized spending of her mother's retirement savings, which Helen had discovered just days before the attack. During January 2024, Julia inflicted severe blunt force trauma on her mother. The attack was brutal and sustained. Helen suffered multiple injuries from being struck repeatedly. The nature of the injuries indicated significant force and determination. After the attack, Helen passed away from her injuries. Julia then attempted to conceal what had happened. She engaged in cleaning activities designed to remove evidence of the assault. She tried to make the scene appear different from what had actually occurred. When Helen's passing was reported to authorities, police began investigating. They responded to what was initially described as a suspicious occurrence. As they examined the circumstances and the scene, inconsistencies emerged. The physical evidence did not align with the explanation being provided. Police began to focus their investigation more closely on Julia. They examined the relationship between mother and daughter. They looked at financial records and communications. They analyzed the physical evidence from the scene. What drives someone to harm the elderly parent in their care? The investigation led to Julia being charged with taking her mother's life. The case went to trial at the High Court in Wellington. During the trial, the prosecution presented evidence of the blunt force trauma Helen had suffered. They showed the jury the cleaning attempts Julia had made. They presented evidence suggesting a breach of trust had occurred between mother and daughter. The defense attempted to argue various points, but Julia denied taking responsibility for what had happened to her mother. The jury heard all the evidence over the course of the trial. They deliberated on what they had heard and seen. In July 2025, they returned with their verdict. Julia was found guilty of taking her mother's life. The conviction reflected the jury's conclusion that the evidence proved Julia had caused Helen's passing. The case then moved to the sentencing phase. Justice Churchman presided over the sentencing hearing. On September 5, 2025, Justice Churchman sentenced Julia to life in prison with a minimum term of 18 years. The judge emphasized the brutality of the attack and Helen's vulnerability as an elderly person dependent on her daughter. The judge noted that there were no mitigating factors that would justify a lesser sentence. Julia's denial of responsibility, even after conviction, was also noted. The minimum term of 18 years meant Julia would not be eligible to even apply for parole until she had served at least that much time. Helen Gregory's family provided statements about the impact of her loss. They spoke about the ripple effect her passing had created through the family. Helen had been a person they loved and relied upon. Knowing that her own daughter had been responsible for her passing made the grief more difficult to process. The family had to reconcile the loss of Helen with the knowledge that Julia, also a family member, had caused it. As of 2026, Julia Deluni remains incarcerated in New Zealand. She will not be eligible for parole until at least 2043, when she reaches her early 70s. If you've made it this far and enjoy deep dives into the most shocking criminal cases, hit that subscribe button and don't forget to press the bell icon. The next case would involve a confrontation that ended with disposal in a remote location. Ghazal Jessica Mansouri. Ghazal Mansouri, who went by the name Jessica, had been living in San Diego for 3 decades. She had been born in Jordan, and her family had connections to Afghanistan. She lived in the Serra Mesa neighborhood with her 79-year-old mother, Maria Mansouri. The relationship between mother and daughter had deteriorated over time. Conflicts had become more frequent. There were issues related to substances that exacerbated tensions in the household. On September 23, 2013, a confrontation occurred between Ghazal and her mother. The argument escalated. During this conflict, Maria was strangled. Evidence presented at trial suggested that Maria was strangled with a bicycle inner tube, which was a key piece of forensic evidence linking the physical method to items found in the family's garage. After Maria passed away, Ghazal faced a decision about what to do with her mother's body. Rather than contact authorities, she chose concealment. She transported her mother's remains to a remote area near the Barona Reservation, far from the Serra Mesa residence. Maria's body was discovered on October 2, 2013. The location was isolated, which had likely been intentional. However, the body had been exposed to the elements and to wildlife. Animals had caused significant damage to the remains. When investigators examined the scene and the body, they began working to identify the victim and determine what had happened. The investigation led them to Ghazal relatively quickly. What would drive someone to dispose of their mother in such a way? When questioned by police, Ghazal admitted to dumping her mother's body at the remote location. However, she denied being responsible for her mother's passing. She attempted to create a narrative in which she had found her mother already deceased and had panicked about what to do. The forensic evidence contradicted this account. The evidence of strangulation suggested an intentional act rather than natural causes. The decision to transport the body to such a remote location also indicated consciousness of wrongdoing. The case went to trial in January 2015. The prosecution presented evidence about the deteriorating relationship between mother and daughter. They showed the jury the circumstances of Maria's passing and the subsequent disposal of her body. They argued that the strangulation and disposal demonstrated deliberate action. The defense attempted to argue that Ghazal had not intended to cause her mother's passing, that perhaps the confrontation had escalated beyond what she intended. The jury found Ghazal guilty of first-degree taking of life. The verdict reflected their conclusion that the evidence showed intentional action and premeditation in disposing of the body. On March 6, 2015, Ghazal was sentenced to 25 years to life in prison. This sentence meant she would serve a minimum 25 years before becoming eligible for parole consideration. During the proceedings, Maria's family members spoke about their loss. One family member, a niece, described Ghazal's actions as inhuman. The family struggled to understand how someone could treat their own mother in such a manner. The remote disposal of the body, leaving Maria's remains exposed to animals and the elements, seemed particularly callous. Throughout the trial and sentencing, Ghazal showed no apparent remorse for what had happened. As of 2026, Ghazal Mansouri remains incarcerated in a California prison. While her standard parole eligibility is in the late 2030s under California's elderly parole program, Ghazal may be eligible for a hearing as early as 2034, provided she remains in good standing, as she was over the age of 50 during her incarceration. Another case would involve mental health issues and extreme actions. Delilah Sherwood Evans. Delilah Sherwood Evans had experienced a difficult upbringing. She had been dealing with mental health issues, including hearing voices and experiencing beliefs disconnected from reality. By the time she was 17, these conditions had gone largely untreated or inadequately managed. She lived with her mother, Sonia Ryang, who had disabilities that made her vulnerable and dependent on assistance. On Christmas Day in 2011, in Clinton Township, Michigan, something tragic occurred in the home Delilah shared with her mother. During that day, Delilah attacked Sonia. The attack was sustained and brutal. Sonia was stabbed 111 to 124 times. The number of wounds indicated a prolonged assault. Sonia, already vulnerable due to her disabilities, had no ability to defend herself or escape. She passed away from the injuries. After the attack, Delilah engaged in cleaning activities at the scene. She attempted to remove evidence of what had occurred. She then fled the residence. Police located her at a store and took her into custody. When questioned, Delilah made statements suggesting she believed her mother had been practicing harmful rituals. She claimed Sonia was involved in activities that Delilah found threatening. These statements reflected her disconnection from reality rather than actual circumstances. How does the justice system handle extreme actions driven by mental health conditions? Delilah underwent extensive mental health evaluations. Experts diagnosed her with conditions involving both mood disturbances and disconnection from reality. They determined that at the time of the incident, she had been experiencing severe symptoms. The question became whether she could be held criminally responsible given her mental state. The trial took place in 2018. The prosecution presented the extensive forensic evidence, including the number and nature of wounds. The defense presented the mental health evaluations. The jury found Delilah guilty, but mentally ill of first-degree taking of life. This verdict acknowledged both that she had committed the act and that mental illness had been a significant factor. On April 5, 2018, Judge Coretti sentenced Delilah to life in prison without the possibility of parole. The judge described the attack as brutal. Sonia's family members attended the proceedings and demanded justice despite the mental health factors. However, the case did not end with that sentence. In 2021, an appeals court reviewed the conviction. They found that during the investigation, there had been improper questioning of Delilah. The prosecution had obtained statements that should not have been admissible given the circumstances. Based on this prosecutorial misconduct, the conviction was overturned. A new trial was ordered in 2022. This meant Delilah would face another jury to determine her responsibility. In December 2023, Delilah Evans avoided a retrial by pleading no contest but mentally ill to second-degree murder. She was sentenced to 20 to 40 years in prison, with credit for the 12 years she had already served. The next case would involve financial motives taken to an extreme. Candace Craig. In May 2023, in Prince George's County, Maryland, 46-year-old Candace Craig was living with her 71-year-old mother, Margaret Craig. Financial issues had become a source of conflict in the household. Candace had been taking money from her mother's pension and Social Security benefits. When Margaret discovered this misappropriation, she confronted Candace. The confrontation would lead to one of the most disturbing cases in recent Maryland history. During the argument over the financial situation, Candace strangled her mother. Margaret passed away from the strangulation. What happened next shocked investigators and the community. Rather than contact authorities or attempt to conceal the body through burial or disposal in a remote location, Candace took extreme measures. She used a chainsaw to dismember her mother's body. She then placed remains on a grill and burned them. The actions suggested a calculated attempt to destroy evidence. Candace stored body parts in bags in the basement. She continued living in the home with these remains present. She also enlisted help from her daughter, Salia Hardy. The involvement of another family member added another disturbing dimension to the case. The situation might have continued longer, but eventually authorities were alerted. When police responded to a wellness check at the residence, they discovered evidence of what had occurred. The scene was disturbing even for experienced investigators. Could financial greed truly drive someone to such extreme actions? The investigation uncovered the full scope of what Candace had done. Salia Hardy became a crucial witness for the prosecution. She said did not see the strangulation itself, but assisted her mother in the dismemberment and burning of the body on a charcoal grill. Her testimony was graphic and disturbing, but necessary for the jury to understand what had occurred. Forensic evidence supported Hardy's account. The remains, found in the basement, matched Margaret Craig. Evidence of burning and dismemberment confirmed the methods described. The trial took place in November 2024. It lasted 8 days. The jury heard testimony from Salia Hardy. They heard from investigators who had processed the scene. They saw forensic evidence about the dismemberment and burning. The prosecution argued that Candace had acted deliberately to eliminate her mother and continue accessing the financial benefits. They emphasized the extreme measures taken to destroy evidence. The defense had little to work with, given the strength of the evidence and Hardy's testimony. The jury found Candace guilty of first-degree taking of life, tampering with evidence, and improper disposal of remains. In February 2025, Candace Craig was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole plus 18 years for the murder of her mother and the subsequent dismemberment and disposal of the remains. During sentencing, the horror of what had been done to Margaret was emphasized. She had been strangled, dismembered, and burned by her own daughter. The financial motive made the actions even more callous. Margaret's life had been reduced to a source of income that Candace wanted to maintain access to. The use of a chainsaw and grill added elements that seemed designed to completely destroy Margaret's remains and identity. As of 2026, Candace Craig remains incarcerated in Maryland. The case drew widespread attention due to the extreme nature of the disposal methods and the financial motive. Another case would involve an orchestrated plan rather than a direct act. Jennifer Pan. Jennifer Pan grew up in Markham, Ontario, Canada, as the daughter of Vietnamese immigrants who had very strict expectations for their children. Her parents, Bish Ha and Hue Han Pan, pushed her toward academic excellence and planned out her future career path. The pressure was intense. Jennifer began creating an elaborate web of lies to meet her parents' expectations. She faked report cards. She pretended to attend university when she was not enrolled. She created a false life that her parents believed was real. As Jennifer grew older, maintaining these lies became more difficult. Her parents had strict rules about her personal life, including relationships. Jennifer was secretly involved with someone they did not approve of. She felt trapped between the life her parents demanded and the life she wanted. The pressure built over years. Eventually, Jennifer made a decision that would shock everyone who knew the family. She would arrange for her parents to be harmed. In November 2010, Jennifer orchestrated a plan involving hired individuals. Her ex-boyfriend Daniel Wong and others were enlisted to carry out an attack at the Pan family home. On November 8th, armed individuals entered the residence. Jennifer's mother, Beach Ha, was shot and passed away. Her father, Hue Han, was also shot but survived his injuries. The attack was staged to appear as a home invasion robbery. Jennifer played the role of a victim, claiming she had been tied up by the intruders. How could someone plan harm against their own parents? However, Jennifer's father survived and was able to provide information to investigators. He identified that the supposed intruders had seemed to know the family. Details emerged that contradicted the robbery narrative. Police began focusing on Jennifer. During interrogation, her story began to fall apart. She provided different versions of events. Investigators found inconsistencies. Eventually, evidence emerged connecting her to the planning of the attack. Phone records, witness statements, and other evidence showed Jennifer had been central to arranging what happened. The trial took place in 2014. The prosecution presented evidence of Jennifer's elaborate lies to her parents over the years. They showed how she had felt trapped and had seen this as her escape. They presented evidence linking her to the planning of the attack. They showed that her motive included both wanting independence and potentially accessing insurance money. Jennifer's father testified against her, a painful situation for everyone involved. In 2015, Jennifer was convicted of first-degree taking of life and attempted taking of life. She was sentenced to life in prison with no possibility of parole for 25 years. Jennifer maintained her innocence throughout. She appealed the conviction. In June 2024, the Supreme Court of Canada affirmed the Ontario Court of Appeal's decision to order a new trial for Jennifer Pan on the first-degree murder charge, while her conviction for the attempted murder of her father remains standing. As of 2026, Jennifer Pan awaits her new trial. She remains incarcerated at Grand Valley Institution for Women in Ontario. Another case would involve an influence from an older partner, Jasmine Richardson. Jasmine Richardson was born on October 21, 1993, in Medicine Hat, Alberta, Canada. She grew up in a middle-class household with her parents, Deborah and Mark Richardson. She had a younger brother. By most accounts, Jasmine had been a good student and seemed to be developing normally. However, during her early teenage years, she became interested in alternative subcultures online. She began identifying with certain online communities and changed her appearance and interests accordingly. When Jasmine was 12 years old, she became involved with a 23-year-old man named Jeremy Steinke. The relationship was inappropriate given the significant age difference. Jasmine's parents became aware of the relationship and strongly disapproved. They forbade Jasmine from seeing Jeremy. They implemented rules to keep them apart. For Jasmine, who was at a rebellious age, these restrictions felt intolerable. Rather than accept her parents' authority, she and Jeremy began discussing extreme measures. On April 23, 2006, Jeremy came to the Richardson family home in Medicine Hat. What occurred that night would shock the community. Jasmine's parents, Deborah and Mark, were attacked and stabbed multiple times. They both passed away from their injuries. Jasmine's younger brother was also harmed and did not survive. The entire family except Jasmine was gone. After the attacks, Jasmine and Jeremy fled together. The scene suggested extreme determination in carrying out the plan. Could a 12-year-old truly understand the permanence of such actions? The two were quickly located after authorities received tips about their whereabouts. When arrested, Jeremy made statements that suggested he took pride in what had been done. The investigation revealed that Jasmine and Jeremy had discussed the plan beforehand. They had talked about eliminating the obstacles to their relationship. Messages between them showed planning and agreement on what would happen. The question became how to handle charges against someone as young as Jasmine. Because Jasmine was 12 at the time of the incidents, she was charged as a juvenile under Canada's Youth Criminal Justice Act. Her trial took place in 2007. Due to her age, her identity was protected by publication bans. The prosecution presented evidence of her involvement in planning and carrying out what happened to her family. The defense argued about her age and the influence Jeremy had exerted over her. In 2007, Jasmine was found guilty of 3 counts of first-degree taking of life. However, because she was a juvenile, the sentencing was different from what an adult would receive. She was sentenced to 10 years in intensive rehabilitation programs. This was the maximum sentence available under the Youth Criminal Justice Act. The sentence focused on rehabilitation rather than purely punishment. Jasmine spent time in various facilities receiving treatment and education. During her incarceration, she reportedly expressed remorse for what had happened to her family. In May 2016, after serving her full sentence, Jasmine Richardson was released. Because she had been a juvenile, her record was eventually sealed and closed to the public following the completion of her sentence and the expiration of the access period. Publication bans mean her current identity and whereabouts are protected and unknown to the public. Jeremy Steinke received a much harsher sentence as an adult. He was sentenced to life in prison with no possibility of parole for 25 years. He remains incarcerated. The final case would involve questions about justice and wrongful conviction. Nora Jackson. Nora Jackson had experienced trauma early in her life when her father was taken from them in an unsolved case in 2004. This loss affected Nora deeply. She was living in Memphis, Tennessee with her mother, Jennifer Jackson. The relationship between mother and daughter had become strained during Nora's teenage years. There were typical conflicts about rules and freedom. Nora had begun experimenting with certain substances, which her mother disapproved of. On June 5, 2005, Jennifer Jackson was found in her Memphis home. She had been stabbed over 50 times. The scene was brutal. The attack had been sustained and intense. When police began investigating, they looked at who might have had motive and opportunity. Nora, as Jennifer's daughter, came under suspicion. Investigators noted that Nora had attended a party on the night of the incident. Her timeline and whereabouts became subjects of scrutiny. However, there was a significant problem with building a case against Nora. No forensic evidence linked Nora to the scene. No DNA, no fingerprints, no physical evidence connected her to what had happened to her mother. Despite this lack of physical evidence, prosecutors moved forward with charges. They built a circumstantial case based on the strained relationship and the estate Nora would inherit. The case went to trial in February 2009. The prosecution presented their theory that Nora had harmed her mother for financial reasons and over ongoing conflicts. Can someone be convicted without physical evidence linking them to the act? The jury heard the circumstantial case. They deliberated on whether the evidence was sufficient. They found Nora guilty of second-degree taking of life. On March 27, 2009, she was sentenced to 20 years and 9 months in prison. The judge made statements about Nora having harmed someone who loved her. Nora maintained her innocence. Throughout, she insisted she had not been responsible for her mother's passing. However, the conviction stood and she began serving her sentence. What the jury had not known would eventually change everything. During the trial, prosecutors had withheld evidence that could have helped Nora's defense. There was information about potential alternative suspects and alibis that had not been shared with the defense team as required by law. This prosecutorial misconduct was eventually discovered. Nora's legal team filed appeals based on this violation. On August 22, 2014, the Tennessee Supreme Court overturned her conviction. The court found that the withheld evidence could have affected the trial's outcome. Rather than face another trial, Nora entered what is called an Alford plea in 2015. Nora Jackson entered an Alford plea to voluntary manslaughter, a significantly lesser charge than second-degree murder, which resulted in her immediate release in August 2016. Following her release, Nora has lived privately. She continues to maintain her innocence in her mother's passing. The lack of physical evidence linking her to the scene remains a significant factor in questions about whether she was truly responsible. The prosecutorial misconduct that led to her conviction being overturned highlighted serious problems in how her case was handled. For Jennifer Jackson's family, the situation created division. Some believed Nora was responsible. Others questioned whether the right person had been held accountable. As of 2026, the case of who truly took Jennifer Jackson's life remains officially unresolved. Nora's Alford plea means she has a conviction, but maintains innocence. The withheld evidence and lack of forensic links have led some to believe this represents a wrongful conviction. This was all from our side today. Thanks for watching. Click here to check out another video.